Hello and welcome to the author panel on writing about the Kennedys. I'm Ashley Hasty of hastybooklist.com. I have Michelle Gable, Kerri Maher, Gill Paul, Stephen Rowley, and Stephanie Marie Thornton with me. I'm just going to read their quick bios before we begin. Michelle Gable is the New York Times bestselling author of 5 books, including A Paris Apartment and the upcoming The Bookseller's Secret in 2021. A San Diego native and graduate of the College of William and Mary, Michelle spent 20 years in finance before retiring to write full-time. She lives in Cardiff by the Sea, California, with her husband, 2 teenage daughters, and 1 geriatric cat and a tight street dog. Welcome, Michelle. Kerri Maher is the author of The Girl in White Gloves about movie star turned princess Grace Kelly, and The Kennedy Debutante about JFK's favorite younger sister, Kathleen Kick Kennedy. She is also the author of a memoir for aspiring writers. This is not a writing manual, notes for the young writer and the real world, under the name Kerri Majors. She holds an MFA from Columbia University and founded Yarn, an award-winning literary journal of short-form YA writing. Welcome, Kerri. Gill Paul is the best-selling author of 10 historical novels, many of them describing real women she thinks have been overlooked or misjudged by historians. The Secret Wife and The Lost Daughter bring to life 2 of the Romanov and Grand Duchesses. While in her recently published novel, Jackie and Maria, she looks at the way Jackie Kennedy's and Maria Callas's lives began to overlap as they became rivals for Aristotle Onassis. She lives in London with her partner, who is a light artist and loves wild swimming year-round. Stephen Rowley is, welcome, Gill. Stephen Rowley is the best-selling author of Lily and the Octopus, a Washington Post notable book of 2016, and the editor named by NPR and Esquire magazine as one of the best books of 2019. Rowley's fiction has been published in 19 languages, and both novels are in development as feature films. He lives in Palm Springs with his partner, the novelist Byron Lane. Welcome, Stephen. And Stephanie Marie Thornton is a writer and high school history teacher who has been obsessed with infamous women from history since she was 12. Her first 4 novels are about women from ancient history. Her more recent novels are American Princess, a novel of first daughter Alice Roosevelt, which centers on Theodore Roosevelt's hellion of a daughter, followed by And They Called It Camelot, an intimate retelling of Jackie Kennedy's life. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this author panel on writing fiction about the Kennedys. So most of you know that I have a set of signature questions from the author interview series I do on hastybooklist.com. This is sort of a lightning round, first things that comes to mind type interview. Think of it as like an interview warm-up for when we really get into talking about the Kennedys. So we'll start with Stephanie and just kind of work our way around clockwise, if that's okay. All right, so author you draw inspiration from?
Right now, Mary Shelley, because she was revolutionary for, being the author of Frankenstein, but also wrote many other novels. And at the same time, she was a wife and a mother. So juggling lots of responsibilities, which I also struggle with sometimes. So.
Oh, I think we lost Michelle, so I'll go to Stephen.
Okay, Michael Chabon, I think The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay is one of my all-time favorite books. But particularly for this project, my book, The Editor, which we'll be talking about today, his book Wonder Boys was a big inspiration.
Jill?
Paula McLean's The Paris Wife really inspired me to start writing biographical historical fiction. It's a wonderful book. So I'd say Paula McLean.
So, I would also say Paula McLean. I was in a book club almost 10 years ago and we read that book and it was such an eye-opener for me. And I didn't have any idea at the time that I would ever write a book that in that same category. And here I am, these almost 10 years later. So, yeah.
Favorite place to read a book?
My sunroom. It's got red walls and a lovely view.
I live in Palm Springs, California, where it's been like 115, 120 degrees for the last couple months. So I'm going to say a swimming pool under an umbrella.
Oh, is it me? Sorry. I just really like reading in bed with a cup of tea. Is that boring?
Not at all, no. That's lovely.
Should we go down to Michelle first?
Michelle, where's your favorite place to read a book?
Really anywhere outside. I live pretty close to the beach, and I do like the beach, although I don't get down there as much as I would like to, but anywhere outside, or really anywhere. I read a lot of my daughter's softball games, so.
Kerri?
I love to read on my couch with my dog curled up next to me. He's a good snuggler, and it's nice to do that with him.
I hope we don't hear from my dog, but I have been hearing him bark a couple of times, so hopefully that's not coming through. But if so, we'll welcome the pups as well. Do you prefer hardback, paperback, ebook, or audiobook?
Right now, definitely either paperback or hardback. As a teacher, I'm in front of a screen all day, so no Kindle for me right now.
I'm the same. Prefer printed. I spend too much time in front of the computer as it is. And if pages get wet, that's not as big a deal as dropping the Kindle into the pool. So.
Definitely paperback for carrying around, you know, for when you get stuck on a bus or something like that. But there's some authors you just have to buy in hardback because you want to read it straight away.
Should I go next? I love paperback and hardback, and I do all my advanced reading on a Kindle, but actually my favorite thing is audiobooks. I've become a huge audiobook listener. I can do it when I'm like puttering around town or in my house doing laundry. I can be reading anytime. So most of my fun reading actually takes place on Libro FM these days.
And I'm a hardback and paperback. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I'm having technical issues. Okay, good. Hardback and paperback for me as well, but I do love audio because it is so, you know, you take it anywhere, walk the dog, clean the house, you know, whatever you're doing, it makes it that much more enjoyable.
Yep.
When it comes to writing, do you prefer pen and paper or computer?
It depends on the book. I actually wrote a couple books that were mostly pen and paper, but more recently on computer.
Computer, always.
I sort of alternate between the two for different drafts and different edits. So.
I'm exclusively computer now, except when the page proofs come, I do like to do those with a pen. I like to actually see the way the pages look on a piece of paper. I used to compose on the computer and do edits by hand. I don't do that anymore. I do only that last stage by hand.
I do a combination, mostly by computer. I always edit by hand though, after like the first time I go through, and it's just easier to bring it around versus bringing my computer around everywhere. So pretty much it's the computer, but with the writing when I need to.
Who or what book character do you think you would be best friends with?
I thought this is such a hard one, but right now I'm gonna go with Katniss Everdeen because she's pretty fierce, and I feel like we need some ferocity right now.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat also a little bit and say, well, since I wrote about Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and we'll be talking about that, I just read Curtis Sittenfeld's Rodham, and so I'm going to say young Hillary Rodham because I wanted to see how someone else tackled writing about first ladies.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd like to say Alice Roosevelt from Stephanie's American Princess because I just loved her.
Probably Hermione Granger from Harry Potter.
Yeah.
It was my second choice.
These are all such great choices. I would have to say, I mean, she's a real person, but she's the main character of the book I'm working on now, Nancy Mitford, who's a writer. I love her sense of humor and her, you know, just her kind of biting wit.
If you weren't an author, what would you be?
I'm also a teacher, so that's my but I actually was going to college to be a biological anthropologist, which meant I would have got to dig up mummies and dead people. So that was the career path. And before that, I was a Disney animator. I've been all over.
Wow.
That's a good, I feel like this is another cheat answer, but I would say monologuist. I was obsessed with Spalding Gray. Was one of the first people who got me interested in the idea of writing, but the idea of writing and then some sort of performance aspect for it on stage, or doing a one-man show kind of thing.
Wow, yeah. I actually studied medicine at university, but I have to say that the world had a really great escape by the fact that I'm not a doctor, because that would have been disastrous.
Probably something to do with food. I really love to cook and eat and all the things. I'm not sure I could handle the life of a chef, but the world of food is large and interesting. So something out there with food.
Well, I actually worked for 20 years in finance, so I would still be doing finance. My most recent job was the head of investor relations for a software company, a large software company, and I left that a few years ago after I'd had 2 books out. So I loved that job. It was great, but it was just too much to do both.
What's your favorite decade in fashion history?
There are so many, but I think turn of the century, when I was writing about Alice Roosevelt, all of those House of Worth gowns were pretty fun to research / procrastinate writing while looking at.
I'm going to say the 1920s, maybe, whenever Great Gatsby and sort of Downton Abbey. That's, you know, someone said they liked my vest at an event once, and I said, well, it's a waistcoat. So I'm going to say the 1920s.
I'm going for the 1930s for the bias cut kind of slinky tea dress look, which I would like to be dressed in the whole time.
I really fell in love with the 50s when I was writing about Grace Kelly. Those waists and the beautiful skirts. It's just so feminine, and but they could still wear jeans that were sort of rolled up with loafers and a sweater set. So all of it was good.
So I'll pick the decade that people 20s, 30s, 50s. I'm going to pick the 40s. I do love the 40s. I especially love how in England, how the make, do, and mend, and they would make these really the things that people would come up with, the clothing designs, even though it was wartime, austerity measures, all this. It was just fascinating to me. Very creative. And I also have to say I love early seasons of Mary Tyler Moore. So that's late 60s, early 70s. Very cute little mini dresses.
I wrote my dissertation on World War II war brides. So 1940s is one of my favorite decades too. When we can travel again, where would you like to go?
So many places. I had a trip to Morocco planned this summer, so that would be at the top of my list. And Mongolia. I've already told my husband, when we can go places again, we are going all out.
Yeah, this question almost feels cruel with my passport collecting dust. But I've been to Italy the past 3 years. I would always go back to Italy, but I really want to go on safari to Africa or Kenya. I think something like that.
Top of my list at the moment for a couple of years now has been Burma or Myanmar, and really hope to get there soon.
I would really love to go to Cuba. And I would also really love to go to India.
Steven stole my answer for safari. That is a dream of mine, although I don't.
We can go together.
Yes, because my husband doesn't want to go, so perfect.
Okay.
What would you say is your signature drink?
If it's before 5 p.m., probably a nice hot mug of chai. If it's after, probably a glass of red wine.
Martini, very dry, usually vodka, sometimes gin with olives. I have a line in my upcoming book. The closest you want to be to a bottle of vermouth is looking at it from across the room. So whatever it is, it has to be dry.
That's very specific. For me, it would have to be a glass of champagne, like Maria Callas. But if that's not available, I'm always open to offers.
Well, in the morning, I love my coffee with a splash of milk. Throughout the day, I love Spindrift sodas. Those are great. And when I'm gonna really have a drink, I love a dirty martini, also vodka. I could handle a little bit of vermouth, but just a little.
I'm famous for drinking Diet Coke in the morning, which I know is very gross, but I do. And I like a good full-bodied red wine. And then kind of our family, my extended family, my siblings, my cousins, my uncles, aunts, that drink is a margarita on the rocks, no salt. So
Joan Didion drank Diet Coke in the morning. It was either Coke.
Did she?
Yes, it was.
Oh, I'm in good company.
A great Netflix thing about Joan Didion that you should.
I saw that too. I'm surprised I didn't notice that because everyone makes fun of me.
And like soda.
Love it.
Okay, last question in the lightning round. What is the last book you read?
I just finished an advanced copy of Jennifer Robson's Our Darkest Night, which is set in Italy in World War II, and I'm also a fan of Italy. So even though it was World War II, I very much enjoyed that particular story. Jennifer is an amazing storyteller.
I just read Sigrid Nunez's The Friend. She's a new book out now, but I just finished The Friend because I'm a couple years behind. But we shared space on a jigsaw puzzle, which has been another quarantine activity of book-themed dog covers, and she was next to my first novel, Lily and the Octopus, and as I was putting together the puzzle, I'm like, oh, I forgot to read that one, so I quickly rectified that, and it's great.
Well, I just finished Michelle's The Summer I Met Jack, which is just wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
And right before that, I read The Editor by Stephen last weekend, so I've been having a great week of reading.
The last book I finished was The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, and it was everything that people say in it. So I listened. That was an Audible book. So if you're out there and you're an audiobook person, it's a terrific audiobook. The two readers are phenomenal.
That is a great book. I agree. And I love what Stephen said, The Friend. That's one of my, that book, I was like sobbing. Loved that book. My dog is sitting right next to me right there. I'm almost at the end of Frederick Bachman's latest, The Anxious People. I was like looking to the side because I have it over there. Anxious People. So it's very, very good. I'm very close to the end.
Okay, so these next three questions, we will get into what it is like to write fiction about the Kennedys. Anyone who wants to answer can. You don't all have to answer, and you don't have to go in any particular order. So let's start with, why do you think interest in the Kennedy family has endured for so many years?
I can jump in and say, you know, particularly now in the moment we have in this country, in America, there is something about sort of that class and that nostalgia and that softer presentation of our politics, and it's sort of an elevated, you know, sort of time that is in such contrast to where we are now. And I think that we're sort of crying out for some of that, so, you know, a return to that sort of glamour and class and normalcy.
I also think
sorry.
Go ahead,
Michelle.
I also think there's also, I agree with that, Stephen, and I also think there's something about that. They have this presentation that was very cultivated, at least by Jackie, and then and they were very, you know, as you talked about, glamorous and all that, and then, you know, there's all these layers behind them, and I think that contrast is interesting, on top of the fact that, you know, it makes you feel a little bit better about your own issues in your life when you're like, okay, even you can have all the money in the world and all the power and still, so there's something there. But they are a fascinating group, and there's so many of them, so there's so many different stories.
I wondered if it was something like the British royal family, and obviously I've grown up with the British tradition where we do, you know, they don't crop up in the papers here that often, what all the younger members are doing, but when you see them so much in the papers, you feel as though you know a bit about them, and you really don't. They're quite inscrutable. They're not writing autobiographies. They're not posting their dinner on Instagram or cat videos on Twitter or whatever. So they have that air of mystique, which is what works for the royal family a bit. And maybe there's something similar going on.
And yet, I would say, I agree with all of that all three of you have said. And yet, you know, their tragedies have been so public, and so relatable to so many of us. I mean, people who have lost children and siblings and endured other kinds of tragedies and addictions and all the whole laundry list of things. And so I think that the fact that they keep bouncing back, that they seem like such a resilient family, is kind of inspiring to people. And we Americans at least like those kinds of stories of resiliency. So
yeah. The tragedy is something you can't escape. I mean, it hangs over
Yeah.
it all, and it's part of the mystique, and it's part of the lure. In writing about Jackie, she lost a child in the White House 3 months before her husband was killed. Like, we barely remember that as a thing. But imagine a first lady losing a child while in the White House. It's almost inconceivable, and yet certainly it's part of the history.
And I think that is definitely part of the appeal of Jackie. One thing that really struck me when I was writing about her was, yes, she was essentially the queen of Camelot, right? Like, she had her own personal designer with Oleg Cassini and those beautiful gowns, and it appeared that she had this perfect family on the outside. But there were so many tragedies, and the strength that woman had to keep picking up and carrying on after she had the loss of Patrick in the White House, but she had also suffered the loss of 2 other children before that. Her husband's assassinated while she's sitting right next to him. And then she's the one who has to sign the papers when Bobby Kennedy was taken off of life support. I mean, it was just one thing after another, but she kept on going.
And she taught a nation how to grieve, that by example. I mean, that's the weight on her shoulder is just unbelievable, and yet such poise and a model for all of us.
So speaking of Jacqueline Kennedy, I would think that she would be the most difficult character from the Kennedy family to take on in fictional form, since she's the most well-known. Those of you that included her in your book, what challenges did you face bringing her character to life?
I can field that one first. So when I wrote And They Called It Camelot, I knew that I had to adhere extremely closely to the historical record, and I wanted to be true to Jackie's voice. So my biggest challenge was making sure that I had done my research. And my husband actually literally just finished a couple weeks ago a new bookshelf for me, because I now have so many books on the Kennedys, and so many, like, all of the facets of Jackie's life, I felt like were documented in some way, but I had to sometimes go in and fill in some gaps. Like, for example, we know that JFK was not a faithful husband, but trying to get inside Jackie's head to find out, well, why did she stay with him? Because there's different layers to that answer, and those answers will change as the story progresses, as her life progressed. Because, by the time she's first lady, she has a daughter and then a son, and she's not going to leave them. But it was definitely something that I had to make sure that I had done my research so that I could stay true to her real life motivations, and again, filling in those gaps.
I wrote about Jackie late in her life, during the time that she worked as a book editor for Doubleday. And a lot of people, again, not one of the top 5 things we think about when we first think about Jackie Kennedy, but she had this extraordinary 15-year career after the end of her second marriage, after her second husband died. So, she sublimated so much of her life to these 2 marriages, and suddenly she stepped out from the shadow of both of these men and put her head down and went to work. And she edited over 100 books during this career, which is just remarkable, and one of the most fascinating things that I find about her life. In terms of writing about that, I had a little bit of, I think, an easier time than Stephanie did, because I'm not covering great stretches of her life, and these, so I could focus on a very sort of narrow time. This is sort of her life in the 1990 until her death. But the challenge there also was this was the most private time in her life. She only granted 1 interview in the whole time that she was working to Publishers Weekly, and then she talked about her authors exclusively and not about herself. So the research for that was really fascinating. Unfortunately, I had a very supportive publisher who put me in touch with some of her old coworkers, some writers that she had worked with that I could speak to. There are two great biographies, nonfiction books about her time as a book editor, and that I could use to help focus my research. And then I read the books that she was editing in real life at the time that I was writing my novel. So I could try to sort of forensically recreate her desk. What other manuscripts were on her desk? What other topics was she interested in at that time? What thoughts were at the forefront of her mind? Because it is very daunting, Stephanie, as you say, to authentically recreate that voice. And that's something, a challenge I know we both took, having read your book, that we both took that so seriously. And, it's incredible responsibility. But the last thing I want to say on that subject is sometimes that's helpful for a writer. Novels can be made out of a whole cloth sometimes. And sometimes it really, when writing historical fiction or writing about a true life historical character, it helps to have some parameters. Sometimes some very narrow parameters, but it helps restrain some of the work, keep it focused and keep it very real.
My version of Jackie comes in time frame between Stephanie's and Stephen's, in fact, because
it's so interesting,
yeah, and I came to it without really preconceived ideas. I mean, I knew that the gaps were there that you talk about, Stephanie. Why did she stay with this man who was womanizing on an industrial scale, we now know? Also, did she sleep with Bobby after Jack died? But for me, one of the huge questions was, why did she marry Onassis? And there's lots, as you said, there's a really layered answer to that. There were so many reasons for her not to. It's just, I don't think she'd really thought through where she was going to live, where her children were going to be educated, or any of that stuff. Or the fact that her sister used to have an affair with him and was seemingly quite miffed about it. The fact that he was actually in a 9-year relationship with Maria Callas at the time didn't seem to kind of cross her mind. But she, so all these questions, I just felt I was going to read all the research, read everything I could find, come to the answer that felt to me to have an emotional plausibility. And I can't say this is the truth, I've discovered what it really was. None of us can, but after reading everything, you come to a version that feels true, and that's all you can do as a novelist, I think.
Yeah, the emotional truth is what's so important, because we can't know everything that she said or thought, but you can certainly do all the research that you possibly can, and then there's going to be a percentage that's your interpretation, your work to discover the truth. It's sort of almost archaeological, sorting through all this research and finding the emotional truth inside.
So the Kennedy story is universally known. How do you think knowing what is going to happen affects the reader's experience? Is this something you thought about or grappled with while you're writing your novels?
Well, for me, it was a little bit different because it focused on this very little known romance that JFK had with a Jewish Polish refugee. And I have yet to, and I went on a pretty big book tour, I've yet to meet a person that's ever heard of her before. And the bulk of it was before he became president. So, it touches on the assassination, but I think a lot of it people don't know. I mean, they know he's going to become president. They're not going to stay together forever, but what comes next? So for me, I think it wasn't as big of a factor. But for books, I mean, I loved everybody's book that's on this panel, and it is, Kennedy's been one of my favorites for a long time, and how that ends, but it's just still nice to go on the journey.
So I wrote about Kick, so she, I'm going to try not to drop any spoilers because, and this is the sort of interesting reason. I wrote my book assuming that most of my audience would, if they didn't know what happened to her, they would Google her by halfway through the book. I have been, okay, you're in the minority. I have been really surprised.
I think that's true, yeah.
People come to me and they're like, I couldn't believe how it ended. And I was like, really? You didn't Google it halfway through? Like, no.
That's straight facts.
I wanted to experience it. And so having written about probably one of the least known Kennedys,
Yeah, for sure.
That's been sort of like a nice surprise, like, you know, that people really did like sit on their hands and like really they didn't want to know. They wanted to be surprised by the ending, and so that was really kind of fun. I mean, I had then a really different. I mean, this is a subject for another time, but I had experience more like I think the other panelists when I wrote a Grace Kelly for my second book, because like everyone knows what happens to her. But anyway, so that was my experience writing that Kick.
Yeah, I think part of the allure is fantasy too, which is, you know, even if the idea of having an affair with JFK or a relationship with JFK, or you know, just being in the family as a sibling or whatnot, or in my case as a coworker, having Jackie as, you know, walking into the break room and she's there, you know, making coffee in a styrofoam cup or something that we all find like very oppressive perhaps in this, and here she is, this woman who like this time in the office kind of set her free in a way, and just to be able to, like, you know, I imagine like walking to a copy room and seeing her elbow deep, like trying to change toner, like Jackie going, what is toner, you know, like what would that be like?
Yes.
But it's all of this is sort of irresistible, I think, to readers, you know, and then to have that air of tragedy just hanging over, you know, all of these stories. You know, it provides just a whole mood when you read anything about the Kennedys.
I had a particular problem with readers coming to my novel, Jackie and Maria, with preconceived ideas or what they knew already, because I'm telling this story half from Jackie's point of view, but half from Maria Callas's. So everybody is going to come to this knowing all the basics of Jackie's story, and most people know very little about Maria's. So early on in the novel, I have to establish Maria as likable and interesting up against a woman whose husband was shot beside her in Dallas, and that was a real challenge. And so I went through various drafts. I mean, I start the story with a Maria chapter and try to get you to, because I really want people to sympathize as much with both of them. So definitely that became a real problem for me. And I went through loads of drafts and showed it to loads of readers just to try and get there.
That must have been really hard, because you don't want people to pick a side before it starts, right?
No.
And that's that.
I don't want people to pick sides at the end as well. I think, you know,
but I mean,
admire them both enormously.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think my biggest challenge in regards to knowing the spoilers was my story picks up right when Jackie is getting ready to meet JFK, and then continues on until the founding of his presidential library. So it's a big chunk. And I dreaded writing the assassination. I dreaded the build up to Dallas. So I decided, you know what, we're just going to put it on page 1. So I spliced those pieces in as like an acknowledgement to readers that I recognize that you know exactly where this is heading. But imagine being Jackie, not knowing where this was heading. There's this it's a sense of doom and tragedy, but also like you want her to be able to enjoy the moments that she has, because you know what's coming. And I think that she was able to you know, enjoy those moments of Camelot. So hopefully that worked for the reader as well.
Michelle and Stephen, I thought your books were a bit unique in this group of books anyway, in that they swayed a bit more towards the fiction of historical fiction. Michelle, in the summer I Met Jack, you provide an alternate history, imagining the romance and child Jack Kennedy may have had with another woman. And Stephen, you imagine what it might have been like to be an author whose editor turns out to be Jacqueline Kennedy, which I just cannot imagine.
No.
Was it difficult to sort of rewrite history in a way for such well-known characters, or do you think it kind of let you off the hook, so to speak, on getting the facts just right?
Well, I don't feel that. Definitely, I imagined this romance, but everything that happens is within known data points. So he did have an affair with Alicia Corning Clark in 1951. It is in the FBI files that Bobby Kennedy paid her $500,000 which is like 4.4 million today, in the weeks leading up to the inauguration, which was 10 years after their affair. And then it was, you know, this whole story came up because I'd read an article that was said, you know, this heiress died, Alicia Corning Clark, and this was a few years ago, and she has this big fortune, but she doesn't have any heirs, except for there might be a love child out there. So I tried to use all the known facts, and luckily, as I mentioned, this was mostly in the early 50s, and he was less studied and, you know, focused on in the early 50s. So I took all the known facts and tried to figure out, okay, well, why would there be a 10-year gap between when they had their affair and the affair broke off? And the Kennedys said in the press, they're like, oh, it's because they're paying her off because they had an affair. And I'm like, well, that does not make sense, because they had an affair when he was not married. So what's the big deal? And that's a lot of money. So and then there was other things. Alicia was kind of a socialite in Hollywood. She dated a lot of famous people, and she was always in the gossip pages. And I read every single, thousands of articles of her being in the gossip pages, you know, hundreds of books. And so it was just kind of trying to marry the two. Okay, I know these facts, and I know this, and, you know, so what might have happened in between those. So I didn't recreate it so much as make assumptions about what we do know, and try to connect the dots. And anyone that's read it, if you, I put together this like little fact versus fiction brochure, and it talks about all the things that are true in there, because some of them I'm like, I got to do this because people they're going to think I made that up, and I totally did not make that up. So anyone's welcome to email me, go to my website, ask for a brochure. I'm happy to email it to anybody that's read the book and wants a copy of it.
Yeah, for me, it begins and ends with the research. If I'm sort of guilty of something as a writer, it's sort of leaning into the sort of fantasy element of it a little bit, because it should be fun. You know, this
Right.
young writer gets his big break when he finds out a big New York publisher is interested in publishing his first novel, and then to walk into the room and discover that the editor that's interested in his book is not only perhaps the most famous editor of all, but the most famous woman, in the country. So, and then through the course of the novel, they develop this very sort of maternal but unexpected friendship. And then, so, I wanted to lean into that a little bit for the fantasy of a reader, but it's all based in reality. She did have writers come, some of her favorite writers come to Martha's Vineyard to work on their books while she was there. She did have drinks with her writers, and she did have, from talking to everybody who knew her and worked with her, the one thing they all come back to is, although she was very reserved about sharing things about herself, she did have this ability, this sort of, I'm blanking on a better example of this, but I'm going to say like Yoda-like ability to draw out of you exactly what you need at that moment. And it was very sort of interesting to use her as sort of a supporting character for this young writer who's caught between not only his own flawed mother, but then on the other hand, this image, this perfect image of America's mother, or motherhood in America. And it was really interesting to write someone sort of trapped between those two. But it was all based in exactly what she did for work and how she was in an office setting.
Kerri, this question's for you. In the Kennedy Debutante, you focused on a lesser known member of the Kennedy family, Kathleen or Kick Kennedy, who's JFK's younger sister. Do you think it was more or less difficult bringing her to life on the page than one of the more well-known members of the Kennedy family?
Well, this was my first historical fiction rodeo, so I cannot compare it to anything. I can tell you that writing about the Kennedys was kind of a stumbling block for me initially. Like I stumbled on this story about Kit Kennedy. I kind of like fell down a Google rabbit hole about her one day, but I was writing the other book that you mentioned earlier. This is not a writing manual, so I couldn't like focus on this subject. And then but I had this like Google doc, I mean, I had this like Word document on my computer with like notes and ideas and links and books, and like it was just like, and it grew, and every once in a while I would go into it, it would like call to me as I was doing other things. And I began to realize that it was like my dirty secret, like that I was like going into this file and like, but I felt like, who was I to write about the Kennedys? I was like at the time I was like a housewife with 5 unpublished novels to my name. Like, I was like, why, like, what am I gonna do, write about the Kennedys? And it was interesting, like, and then I sort of got over that. Like, I told my agent at the time that I had this idea, and she was like, you have to write that book. And so I did start writing it. I started researching it. And then I came up against the same kind of like self-censorship again. And 2 really good friends of mine from two writer friends of mine from completely different parts of my writing life said the same thing to me within like a 2-week period of time. They were like, but Kerri, this is your book, isn't it? And I think this is what everyone has been talking about with the sort of where the imagination comes in, and the fact that it really is fiction. And we are looking for, I love, Jill, you said the emotional plausibility. That is like just the best 2-word like phrase, because I felt like I had figured that part out. I just had to like put my big girl pants on and write it. And so I did.
Yeah, I kept telling myself, they've had so many books written about them that are supposed to be real. Mine is not even real. So like, what do they care about in my stupid book? I'm just some dumb novelist. Like, I'm not like, hey, I was his roommate, let me tell you all the secrets.
But you know, novels can go places that nonfiction can.
Exactly, yes.
And that was ultimately very liberating to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think novels have a way of capturing the reader as well. I mean, it's one thing to read a nonfiction book about any particular person, and there are amazing nonfiction books out there that, you know, I sit down every night with my glass of red wine. I'm like, I can't wait to read the next chapter. But it's different when it's fiction. When you can experience the life of Kit Kennedy or Jackie Kennedy or whoever. It's magical. It's the closest thing to a time machine I feel like we'll ever get.
Yeah. One thing, you know, that I always get asked, you know, back when we had the world and we could do events in person, but you know what, people will come up to me and say, you know, well, what gives you the right to do this? And I have to quickly ascertain, are they asking me a legal question? You know, do you have the right? And certainly Jacqueline Onassis is the very definition of public figure, but oftentimes it's a moral question. And, you know, what really gives you the right to think that you can interpret this woman or this family? And for every artist, that's a, you know, something that we think about, you know. And Kerri, you know, I think too, like the voices, you know, as artists, the voices in our head that devalue our own contribution or our own work sometimes are loud and persistent, and it's part of our job as writers sometimes to silence them at least long enough to say, no, I do have a voice here. I do have a take here that I think is interesting. And as long as I do it with the research and seriousness of mind, that I can take this on. Yeah.
Yeah. Everything he just said.
I mean, I had 2 legal issues. One was that when I started writing, Lee Radziwill was still alive. And I knew I was going to be writing about her affair with Onassis, which she never actually openly admitted. I mean, it was reported in the Washington Post at the time, but even when they phoned her up from the New York Times to check her obituary with her, she still wouldn't admit that she'd ever had an affair with Onassis. So, I mean, I could have been sued over that, I don't know. And then the other legal issue is Maria Callas's estate are terribly difficult. They put a big notice up saying anybody that's going to portray Maria at all have to get permission from the estate first. But the publishers on both sides of the Atlantic legal department said, it's fiction. We say really clearly it's fiction. You can write what you like in fiction.
Those 2 magic words on the cover, a novel. They go a long way.
Yeah, Jill, I'm surprised that they're so adamant you can't write about her, because, you know, but I guess it's the fiction piece that is, because I would think that, I'm glad your, you know, publisher didn't give you a hard time.
Well, let's see. But there is a biographer writing about Maria Callas at the moment. Is being made to jump through all kinds of hoops. So it's tricky. But the moral question is, I mean, you can write novels about anything. Why not? I mean, I did want to ask if any of you thought about how you would feel if Kennedys read your book or get in touch with you, or I mean, does that cross your mind?
Well, so I have a funny I have a funny story about this. So there is a young Kick Kennedy who is she is RFK Jr.'s daughter, and she's on Instagram. And at some point,
she looks like Jackie, actually.
Yeah, I see the original Kick in her a little bit. She's clearly a Kennedy, like she but she started following me on Instagram. But
oh my gosh,
she didn't like anything that I posted.
She's there lurking silently.
But
that would freak me out.
Did any of you guys use the JFK library in Boston? I happen to live close,
I did.
So I went there and everything. And so
I went there too.
I want to hear what your experience was, Michelle, but just one thing was that it became clear to me that the librarians there are in some kind of contact with the family. And so I had some sense that, like, whatever family members were talking to the librarians, we're going to know that this book, my book at least, was on the way. I had no contract for it or anything. I wrote it entirely on spec, so it could have gone absolutely nowhere.
Right.
But that was my other closest contact with the family. So, Michelle, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I wasn't really, I kind of got the same sense too, but thought maybe I was being paranoid about, like, oh, and I just kept telling myself again, like, well, they have to worry about people writing like biographies about them. Mine is not a, anyone's life story. So it always makes me nervous to write about real people, that they're gonna, but I've never been contacted. And it's funny because I've been contacted for my other books who had way more minor characters in them that were real people, but very, very minor, like no one's ever heard of them. And I've been contacted about every single one of my other books, but never, not about this.
The closest I came is from my bookstore spies, is that Carly Simon bought a copy of The Editor at the bookstore on Martha's Vineyard. And Carly did four children's books with Jackie as her editor. And in fact, just earlier this year, I think, or last fall, she published a memoir of her time working with Jackie Kennedy. So, now I feel like I'm one step away.
Yeah.
But I thought, oh, this is the beginning of Carly and I going to be great friends now. But she did not follow me on Instagram, sadly.
Well, you guys, I thought I didn't have enough questions for 30 minutes, and we have already gone our hour. So thank you all so much for joining me. This was so much fun.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. We should form a super group and write a book about the entire.
Oh my God.
I love it. Thanks again. I hope you all have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley, for having us.